Disinflation is inflation at a lower rate. So in other words, you still have inflation, but if it goes from 8% to 6% to 4% to 2%, which is what I'm saying, you still have inflation, perhaps inflation of 2%. And that's not trivial. Look at the value of the dollar and a half in 35 years. So it's, by the time you're, most people are young adults at the time the kids are in college. It's about 35 years, so or less. So that's real. But going from 8% to 2% is a big deal for a couple of reasons. Number one, it means that 8% number is not sustained. But there's a world of difference between, let's say, 1.8% inflation and 6.8% inflation. Those are completely different worlds because one is much more manageable, but it also changes expectations. And expectations are the key. The Fed doesn't control inflation. Everyone's like, oh, they print money, you get inflation. That is not true. It's not true in prices. It might be true in asset prices. It might be true in stocks and bonds and real estate, but that's not the consumer price index. That's not what the Fed looks at. That's not what most economists or many economists mean when they say inflation. They're asset bubbles. Money printing can lead to asset bubbles, but it does not lead to price inflation unless velocity picks up. Velocity is a psychological phenomenon. So if you change the expectations and change the change the psychology, and change the velocity, you will get inflation, but I don't see any of those things changing. What I see is this runs out of steam and we get back down to below 2%. So recession is well defined. It's two or more, or at least two consecutive quarters of declining GDP. Depression sounds worse than recession. And if recession is 2 quarters of declining GDP, a depression must be 10 quarters of declining GDP. It must be way worse. And that's not the definition of a depression. First of all, 10 quarters of declining GDP has never happened. If it did, we'd all be in trouble. Depression means depressed growth, meaning you can have growth in a depression, but the growth is depressed relative to trend, relative to potential. So in other words, if your economy, if the long-term trend of recovery growth in a recovery is 3.5%, which it is, and you're growing at 2%, which we were for 10 years, that's depressed growth. I would say we've been in a depression since 2007, that the entire so-called recovery from 2009 to 2019, it was a 10-year recovery, the longest recovery in U.S. history, but it was also the weakest recovery in 10-year history. The average annual growth for that 10-year period was 2.2%. But for all post-1980 recoveries, average growth was 3.2%. And if you go back to post-World War II recoveries, it's closer to 4%. So if you have an economy that can grow 3-4% and you're growing at about 2%, that 1% is, 1%, what's the big deal? Sorry, 1% of 20 trillion compounded for 10 years is a big number. The new Great Depression is where we are now. Yeah, COVID has not gone away. The pandemic's still here. It's still depressing growth. There's a new headwind to growth, a big one, which is the supply chain breakdown. And that's an area I'm devoting a lot of time and research to right now. Yeah, well, the $15,000 goal is actually very straightforward. It's not a number I pulled out of the air. It's not a number I made up to, attract attention. You don't really need that. But it is the number that gold would have to be, or higher. I mean, it's a base, but it's the lowest number that gold would have to be if you were going to use gold to support the value of the US dollar. If you were going to go on a gold standard, you would basically have to say, well, what's the value of an ounce of gold? Where am I going to set it? Because that's what a gold standard is. Now, by the way, just to be clear, there's not a central banker in the world, with the possible exception of Elena Violina, who's the head of the Central Bank of Russia. She's the only central banker who really stands her job. She's taken gold up to 20%. Slightly more than 20% of Russia's reserves. Russia's reserves just hit a new all-time high of 600 billion, and the gold component is 20% of that. So over $120 billion in gold, about 2,300 tons. And everyone's like, well, yeah, but the U.S. has 8,000 tons. They only have, maybe a little over a quarter of that, but their economy is only 1/12 the size. So when you look at gold relative to GDP, they have a lot more gold than we do, and they're in a much better position. And part of it is just so U.S. sanctions don't hurt them, because they're not relying on treasury bills or dollar payments to support their reserve position because they have a lot of gold. Because one of the objections to a gold standard. People go, yeah, well, maybe we had it once upon a time and maybe it worked okay, but we can never go back there because commerce and credit and trade and bank balance sheets are so high. We don't have enough gold to support that level of commerce. We just don't have enough gold. That's nonsense. There's always enough gold. It's just a question of price. Now, at $1,800 an ounce, no. If you say we're going to go on a gold standard at $1,800 an ounce, and here's how much gold we have, you'd have to cut the money supply by about 75%, and that would throw us into, that would be the Great Depression. That would be, you collapse the economy. If I want a gold standard, I can't peg it at 1,800 because I'd have to cut the money supply by 3/4 or more. So what's the alternative? Raise the price of gold. Pierpont Morgan, everyone turned to Pierpont Morgan, the original JP Morgan. And he got all the bankers in his townhouse in Murray Hill around 35th Street and Madison Avenue in Manhattan. And they did triage. And they broke the banks into 3 categories. They said, okay, you're strong enough to weather the storm. You're okay. This category, you're broke, you're insolvent, you're hopeless. We're going to let you go. And there was a middle category where they were not insolvent, but they were illiquid. So what they said is, okay, the strong banks lend money to these banks. That'll prop them up. We'll keep them open, and these guys will let them fall off a cliff. But what happened was, Pierpont Morgan died not long after that. But they knew that Americans hated central banks, and they do. They still do. So they said, well, don't call it a central bank. Call it the Federal Reserve. It sounds like a brand of whiskey. It's like aged Federal Reserve. But they did all these gimmicks to basically make it not look like a central bank, even though it was. And Walter Bagehot, 19th century writer, sort of had written the playbook for central banking in the mid 19th century. And he said a central bank in a financial crisis should do 3 things. Lend freely to solvent institutions at a punitive rate. Now, what did Ben Bernanke do in 2007? Well, he lent freely. We know that had to increase the balance sheet by $4 trillion. But to solvent and insolvent alike, they lent to everybody. AIG wasn't solvent. Half the banks on Wall Street weren't solvent, but they lent to them anyway. So they didn't follow Bagehot's number 2 rule. They lent to insolvent institutions, and it was not a punitive rate. It was close to 0. So Bernanke broke 2 of the 3 rules. He lent freely, but he lent to everybody, wasn't selective, and he lent at a 0 rate. We have a central bank for all the wrong reasons, but the real problem is that in 1934, during the Roosevelt administration, they reneged on the original Fed deal. They pulled all the power from the regions and put it back in Washington where it is today. And then in the 1970s, I think 1979 or thereabouts, in Humphrey Hawkins' bill, they expanded the mandate of the central bank. It was no longer just price stability, which it always had been. Well, the stated mission was price stability. The real mission is bail out the banks. That's what you're there for.